You can do it. I believe in you.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Lindsay Wong's memoir, The Woo Woo. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will kick things off with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am stepping in today and for many months to come for your usual book club administrator, Erin LeVar, as she is away on maternity leave. Also from the Free Press, we have columnist Jen Zoratti joining us as a host. We have Chris Hall from McNally Robinson, and we also have Lindsay Wong, our author today. We are joining you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Lakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of Red River Métis. There'll be no surprises for tonight's meeting. In a moment here, I'll pass it off to Chris for an introduction, and then Lindsay will take it away with a reading, followed by a Q&A by Jen. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to them when we can. After our discussions today, I will introduce our September pick. And with that, it's over to you, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Nadya. So when I first read the subtitle of The Woo Woo, How I Survived Ice Hockey, Drug Raids, Demons, and My Crazy Chinese Family, I took the word survive, to be hyperbole, emphasis for, in this case, comedic effect. And it didn't take me too far into the book to realize that the word was intended as a little more literal than I had expected. This is humor, but it's a very dark variety. It must be hard enough for the most functional new immigrant to Canada to cope with our collective peculiarities. But the Wong family at the same time tries to overcome past trauma from the poverty they experienced in Hong Kong, as well as the high expectations that come from their Chinese culture. And as if that wasn't enough, there is that largely undiagnosed mental health issues that run in the family, issues that get blamed on ghosts and demons and the woo-woo. There's a lot to unpack here, and Lindsay Wong tackles it impressively in her memoir. The book was shortlisted for the Hilary Weston Writers' Trust of Canada Prize for Nonfiction. It was a selection for the 2019 Canada Reads competition, and it was longlisted for the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor. Lindsay appears to have done much more than survive. After reading this book, my overriding question for Lindsay is, are you okay? We'll get a chance to ask that, among many other questions, but in order to do that, I need to stop talking. So I will pass it on to Lindsay Wong to read from her memoir, The Woo Woo.
Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. And thanks so much to Winnipeg Free Press for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. It's really funny. When you write a memoir, you don't think that a lot of people read it. I honestly thought 5 people, including my agent, would actually sit down, and now 5 years later, people are still asking me to read from this book and talk about it. So it's such a surprise and a delight, I think, in many ways. So thank you again. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 2. It's called Pot Mountain. I was thinking about this excerpt because I'm now located in Winnipeg, and you don't have any mountains here. So I thought it might be a nice little throwback. If you do not make friend at school, my father said, you will turn out woo-woo like your mommy. Attempting to be funny, he made a cuckoo sign around his earlobe and a face that was supposed to be a drooling, pop-eyed zombie. He liked to imitate his wife to relieve the tension in our household. Do you want to wake up and look scary? But you don't have friend, I said, after the teacher called my parents to tell them I had difficulty adjusting to middle school. I gnashed my half-formed molars, frustrated. For how could I adapt? The formative years of elementary school had been squandered in the food court until my father, fed up, hired a woman from Hong Kong to raise us until my mother's phobias subsided. It was she who equipped my mother with an arsenal of recipes for Chinese cuisine and taught her how to properly clean. Middle school was a thrilling possibility for the Wongs to start over, perhaps even a real chance for ostensible middle-class respectability. Daddy doesn't need friend because he is not retarded. My father continued his humor that edged on spitefulness. He liked to quip that I was mentally disabled since my school had me tested, results, TBD, for everything from Asperger's to hearing impairment. He went on cheerfully, retarded people need friend to help them. How much will you pay me if I make friend, I asked. $5, my father said. $10, I said, and 99 cents. Unlike my mother, my father would leave the house for work and somehow two-faced, was able to form business alliances to function in the professional world in a way I was learning to function in school. In his own sad, peculiar way, I think he worried about his children's mental and physical well-being, even if he could be like a standoffish circus clown, preaching advice through hurtful humor and shrill, exaggerated pantomime. My upbringing made me feel alone. I was a bully without realizing that I was a pretty decent one who casually told teachers to fuck off when I did not want to participate in class, which was often. After all, this is what my parents would do. But I was certainly not charismatic enough to build up a loyal mean girl following. My sister and brother were cute, popular children who seemed easy with others on the playground. And as the eldest, my parents' sour-faced guinea pig in childbearing, I was afflicted with my mother's neurosis and father's zealous antisocial tendencies. Still, my father insisted that I should have at least 2 friends, so I could alternate between them. Like Shu, he said, even though he had no friends himself. At that time, I thought that this double standard was supremely unfair. I had a whole entire village of friends in Hong Kong when I was your age, he bragged when I protested. I'm so nice that when someone nice to me, I'm 10 times nicer. But when someone is mean to me, Daddy is 10 times meaner. Why? I said, confused. I can play by myself. You're too retarded to not have friend, he said, frustrated, and then went back to his AutoCAD blueprints. They were usually spread on the dining room table when he decided to work from home to keep watch over my mother, who was still scared of the woo-woo ghosts and couldn't be alone. At least she stopped taking us to the mall's food court after school when we got older, and our moods seemed to slowly improve. She spent her days and nights in the kitchen, compulsively practicing what her former caretaker had taught her, sometimes origami wrapping more than 1,000 cardboard-colored wontons and filling 2 giant freezers. As an adult, I can see the likelihood that my father did not know enough English to explain the subject of friendship properly, and he was genuinely worried about my happiness, which was already spotted and sour, like my gem strip that hadn't been washed in more than a year. Having friends was something I couldn't understand. Although my father had professional acquaintances, my mother had 5 close sisters and 2 brothers, neither of my parents had any friends. My father, I later realized, did not want me to become like my mother. Our house had been christened the Belcara by its builder in an effort to make everyone forget it was a boxy McMansion. The name was supposed to give us an element of inflated class and imply aristocratic lineage that would never exist on a mountain 2 hours from the city of Vancouver, a place known for its gigantic Chinese population. By looking at us, people with no obvious interest in personal hygiene, my mother, siblings, and I had greasy, rag-like hair plus Edie ogre breath, you wouldn't expect us to be comfortable suburbanites. I was not, still not, allowed to know our finances. But even though I thought we were very poor, we must have been at least comfortably middle class, but not small-time millionaires like some of my aunties and uncles. The Western Plateau was a fluent neighborhood with few well-known NHL players. My father had purchased a house because it was the cheapest one on the market in the area. The kitchen, dining room, and living room were on the very top floor, which had turned away every potential buyer except him, as her family did not invite people over. The isolation of the plateau, shrouded by a canopy of black evergreens, was ideal for legally growing and harvesting pot. The plateau, as was mocked in newspapers, had been declared a narco-terrorism zone because of many money-making Asians who acquired luxury real estate for grow-ups and meth labs. This was the hottest gold mountain in history. The plateau had become a neighborhood of Chinese drug millionaires, and it seemed that everyone's hardworking Chinese parents, 3 out of 7 houses on our cul-de-sac, were cultivating BC bud for $250 an ounce, helping to generate a $6 billion industry for the province. No one ever suspected a hastily constructed show-up McMansion was manufacturing drugs. When the story of the many marijuana plantations finally broke in 2004, the local newspapers exaggerated the Poto's crime rate, making it seem like everyone was always waking up to find a dead body on their flawless turf or a bullet hole in their front door. There was an exciting world that seemed more appealing than scary from my child's perspective. No matter how hard I prayed, I could never come across a corpse sprawled grotesquely on the Balcarres' ample driveway. Only once in 2008, when I was 20 years old, did the meth lab a few streets down go boom, the palatial roof blasting high into the gloomy mountain sky, the glass shards from the foyer skylight lashing into lush fronds of banana trees and splashing into the concave fountain like coins. For weeks, the newspapers raved and gushed and gossiped. Posh Westwood Plateau house explodes. As kids, we heard our parents joke that if you purchased a multi-million-dollar toy castle with a multi-million-dollar view, the sellers threw in the Westwood Plateau Asian Barbie, toting her very own hot pink meth lab starter kit. Just a year after we bought the Balcara, the pinkest Barbie house in the middle of the cul-de-sac, mutual acquaintances whispered that the builder could not pay his debts, so his head was blown off at the Plateau Country Club, i.e. by Chinese gangsters. His death was hush-hush and did not make the news. I wondered if one of our criminal neighbors had discovered a creative way of killing him. What do you mean his head blew up? I'd asked when I was 11 years old, not so secretly thrilled with the wildness of his death. Was it like a bomb? Did his head explode? Did his brains go everywhere? Was it hard to clean up? But all the grown-ups in the room told me to shut the fuck up. His brain go kaboom because he had low IQ, my father said, turning this rumor into a lesson about school. He sounded tired and superior, which made me believe him. Thank you so much.
Thank you for reading. I'm always struck, having read your most recent book and also the woo-woo, your power to describe things so vividly, and especially your way with words to describe things that are gross is just unmatched. Like, it's so good. I think maybe to start, I know cathartic is a word that's thrown around a lot, and I know it's thrown around a lot for memoir, but I feel like with this one, it must have been an exorcism of sorts, for yourself, just being able to get all this out and down on paper. So tell me a little bit about that and just the act of actually writing the woo-woo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as I mentioned, I didn't start out thinking I was going to write a memoir. This was a thesis project in grad school where, you go to school, you're away from your family, and you're in workshop, and people are like, "Oh, that's really weird. Why are they hoarding toilet paper? Why are they going to the mall?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's normal." And everyone's like, "No, that's not. You got to write about this." And then I was at UBC. I was doing my undergrad, and my aunt had taken the city of Vancouver hostage by trying to jump off a bridge. And a lot of my professors, a lot of people that I knew were in that incident. And they were like, now I know why I was stuck there for 8 hours. And of course, that becomes something. And then I realized I had all these stories that people were telling me that, you should write a book. I was like, oh, okay. And I think that's where the project evolved. And of course, I wasn't thinking of an audience. It was really just for me to make sense of who I was in relation to my family, where, some you don't know what you're doing, right? And so, I had this book. My agent tried to sell it. People were like, "It's too weird, it's too dark." And I was like, well, I just want something to put on my bookshelf. And then the whole thing just happened. So I think I did feel better writing it. I was able to really kind of see who I was, but at the same time, in so many ways, looking back at this 5 years later, and even then more time has passed, you're a completely different person, right? And you're able to really see, who are these people? Why are they behaving this way?
Yeah, I think I remember we talked in February for the paper, and you had mentioned to me that the woo kept getting rejected, which, having read it now, seems insane to me. But yeah, you mentioned that it had been rejected like 13 times. But I'm wondering if, when you were writing it as just a project for school, if maybe not visualizing the audience helped you not pull your punches and helped you be really honest. Like, I know with the writing I do at the paper, I never think about the fact that people read it. Because you almost can't, right? You almost can't think like, oh my God, there's going to be all these people that are going to read it. My parents are going to read it. All these people are going to read it. I think it makes you really self-conscious. So like, did that help, not kind of having an audience in mind, you just be able to really go there?
Oh yeah. I think anytime when you start thinking about audience, any writer starts they send their head too much, I think, as I tell my students, right? You're suddenly like taking out words that you wouldn't use. You're like, oh no, they're gonna read this anecdote and never talk to me again, right? I'm gonna get fired. And so often I think the writer has to really exist in that bubble. Otherwise, what you want to say will not be told, right? Because so often we're writing for people, right? And I think memoir has to be like that. As soon as you start thinking about who will read it, then, should I publish when my parents are dead? Then you're not going to have a story, right? It's paralyzing. I mean, you can always hide behind fiction. I think in so many ways, fiction is easier. You can be like, yes, I made it up, or that's a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
I don't mean it.
It's like
Exactly. Yeah. With memoir, it's like, here it is. Now I can't hide. But of course, most memoirs don't think their book is going to get written or published. And then with my agent was saying like, oh, do you know what you're going to do for interviews? I'm like, what are you talking about? No one's going to interview me. I'm not going to have to like do this.
Oh my God. And then 5 years later, here you are again talking about it. Amazing. Yeah. A question that I had, but also readers had, has your family read it? Have your parents read it?
So we don't talk about the book. And I ended up doing a documentary for the CBC. It's called Just Leave, Please. And it talks about what happens when you write a memoir. Everyone pretends it's not there, and they're on their best behavior in front of you because they're scared you're going to write about them. So in many ways, it's like your superpower. You just say like, oh, so what are you doing? And everyone's like, nothing, right? And then, all they'll talk to you about is the weather because they're scared you're gonna, take it and then, make a story about it or tell the news or something. So that's what I always say to aspiring writers. Tell them you're gonna write about them, then people will behave better.
Yeah, exactly. I know you had mentioned in interviews when the book came out that your parents had it on hold at the library and that they didn't want to buy it.
I know. Yeah, they thought they'd spent too much money on me. They paid for 2 writing degrees, and they were like, it's 1999, I think, right? I don't know. McNally, is it 1999? Yeah, it's too much money to read about me.
Oh, that's so funny. I also really enjoyed that when the incident with Auntie Beautiful One happened and your dad emailed you because you were in Europe. And he's like, don't tell anybody that was your aunt. And yet here's this memoir. So I love that you just went there and that you just really had no holds barred. And I'm wondering if being able to kind of confront those things head on, if that helped you process them in your own life, because I know that when you were a kid, you weren't really allowed to show many emotions lest the woo-woo get you, right? Unless you let them in, you couldn't be weak. You could be angry, but you couldn't really be sad or cry or any of those things. So through the process of this, and now looking back on it, having, 5 years out from it, I guess, how has your relationship to that changed? And how has that, the processing been of all that, and kind of finding compassion for your family, but also compassion for maybe little Lindsay and your former self?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard because I think, I was raised to be very stoic. I'm still very hard on myself and was like, oh, I could do better, right? And I think it's, just, taking a step back and being like, well, you tried your best, right? And sometimes good enough is good enough. And I think, just learning to live with yourself and trying to be more forgiving, it's something that I struggle with a lot. But I think it's something important, though, just to be able to be like, separating criticism from self
Yeah.
and criticism from your family, and always hearing that. Because I think there's this thing where people who've gone through trauma or poverty, where, you know, they have to be hard emotionally, and they have to tell themselves, you know, stories to survive. And so, you know, that was repeated to my mother. And then she repeated it to myself. And I think just knowing, like, okay, well, she's coming from a different place. She doesn't mean it. You know, she's trying to say, like, you need to be strong so you can get through something. But, you know, so often the circumstances have changed, right? And I think self-care is really important.
It's I think about a couple scenes where your parents show real love and almost tenderness in the way that they know how. When your mom flies to New York despite being afraid of flying, and when you're screaming at each other and she just wants the ghost to leave you and invade her, like, that was such like a moment where I was like, oh, that's like actually really nice. And then when your dad told you to go, I thought that was a really powerful moment too, where it's like, wow, that's such like an expression, like, for people that really had a hard time with that. Those moments for you, revisiting them when you were writing about this, did you see that more clearly?
Yeah, because when it's happening to you, you're just like, oh, okay, that was interesting, or you don't really see that tenderness. But for them, because they don't emote, it's a huge, I think, pivotal shift, right? To be able to be like, oh, okay, they mean well. They don't know how to express it, or they don't know how because of how they were raised, right? And so I think it's really about taking that, and hopefully the reader was able to see that. I know, like, Chinese culture, especially the way I was brought up, is so different than Western culture. I think everyone is so nice, especially in Winnipeg. I don't know, maybe it's the prairies or something, right? And then to be able to, sorry?
It's the friendly Manitoba thing.
Yeah, it must be, right? So it's like such a huge difference. And hopefully the readers are able to see that this is what it means in this family to be a kind person, right? We're not going to hug. We're not going to be like, we're not going to tell you how great you are, right? We're going to tell you your flaws, right? We'll list them, you know, like 20 steps of, you know, what you did wrong. But ultimately, I guess intention is there.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting too, because I think when we think of sort of prairie nice or Canada nice, it's actually conflict avoidance. And I think culturally in the West, we're really terrible at conflict because we think it's always confrontation and that it's always a negative thing, when sometimes it's actually just, no, you have to be assertive and you have to tell people maybe some hard things that they don't want to hear, you know. For you, kind of looking at how mental illness really shaped particularly your matriarchal line. When did you sort of start realizing or thinking about it in terms of, you know, intergenerational trauma and the immigrant experience and sort of the carried inherited trauma that they were bringing with them?
Well, that's a good question. I think I didn't really consider it until, so when I went to grad school, I was diagnosed with MAV, which is that vertigo. And I really thought that this is it. I've lost it. I'm going to jump off a bridge. And then I was reading that schizophrenia sometimes doesn't show up until you're 45 in females. So, you know, I'm not in my 40s yet, so it could happen, right? In 10 years. And so that's always been a frightening thought. But just knowing that, you know, stress, trauma, this could start it all, right? And so that is that fear. And then it also helped really make me think about, you know, where is my mom coming from? Where is my aunt coming from? All these experiences, right? And then coming to another country, learning English, it didn't help, right? It's always really hard to be an immigrant. And I think, you know, we see all these stories about Asian immigrants, like, you know, Kevin Kwan's Crazy Rich Asians. And there's this idea that, you know, Asians are affluent, they don't need to struggle. And that is so not the truth for so many immigrants here in Canada.
Well, and I think the other stereotype that you also just detonated with this book is the idea too that Chinese immigrants specifically are also just nice and quiet and, you know, acquiesce and kind of stay out of sight. Like, your parents are like, you know, like, they are loud and outspoken and vulgar and things that maybe when people are thinking in terms of stereotypes, they're not expecting, right? So I think it does two things. One, I think it shatters some stereotypes people have that are rooted in racial stereotypes, but also mental illness stigma as well. I think it does really, really well.
Thank you. Yeah, mental health. We still don't talk about it enough. And especially in Chinese culture, it's really taboo, right? You don't tell people if you're depressed or you're anxious, right? I have friends who don't even tell their parents that they are needing to see a therapist. So it's still something that's not discussed. And I think so. There's always this thing when people see me, they think, oh, you're very meek, you're very quiet, and you're polite. And sometimes I am, right? You know, you have to be in certain situations, right? You don't want to get fired from your job.
Yeah.
But, you know, what a memoir does is this is like your interiority, right? This is what you're thinking. And so I guess readers get to live in my head a little bit.
Chris, do you have a question you want to jump in with? I feel like
this is great. I wanted to ask you about humor. Very early in the book, you describe yourself, you would huddle under the table, a small kid trying to find the humor to cope with what terrified you. And humor obviously plays a big role in coping, or it has helped you cope. But do you think it's also hindered you in processing these experiences in some way, the good and bad that humor has given you?
I think humor, especially for a lot of people, it's sort of a survival mechanism, right? In order to get through things, you have to be able to process it. You have to be able to laugh at it. You spin it into joke, right? You tell yourself this funny version of the story. Otherwise, the other option is to sit and cry. I would call it hindering, maybe for some people, but for me, it's always been a way to get through the day or to get through something difficult. I think I read somewhere that people who have very difficult childhoods or, you know, horrible things have happened to them, they're able to survive because they're able to laugh at it, right? And so I think humor is going to be part of my storytelling process and how I see the world.
I was thinking of it back to similarities with prairie people, that humor can be used to avoid, to change the subject and to not actually confront what the real thing that's in front of you. Does that resonate at all?
I think it's really much about a survival tactic, right? Sometimes you don't want to engage. Sometimes it's honestly easier to tell a joke, right? Than to sit down and be like, I'm going to tell you how I'm feeling. Because it's not natural for a lot of people. It's not natural for me. You know, I much rather laugh than cry. And I think a lot of people are in that boat as well.
I think it's something I really identified with, because I'm the same way. I also use a lot of humor to cope with things and in writing as well. And also, like when I'm talking about something that has happened to me, I have a very specific urge to turn it into like, well, here's my type 5 about this thing that happened to me. And I find that two people react in two different ways. One is to be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And the other is to laugh. And I'm expecting that the reactions to the woo-woo were kind of split in the same way, where it's like, oh my God, this is horrifying. And other people who found it hilarious. So I think but I think you're able to really move between both, right? But I could see how maybe people would be like, oh my God, I'm shocked by this. And other people are like, this is funny.
Yeah, humor is so subjective, right?
Yeah, there's so many lines that I highlighted that were like made me laugh out loud in the woo-woo and in parts that I was not expecting. So like you would start out, you'd be reading a thing and then it would just like, it just would be perfectly placed in there and it really, I think helps. I think it helps the reader to digest the story. Because I think if it was just sort of, here's a bunch of trauma, I think that's hard. That's a hard hill to climb. And that would be a tougher thing to read. Whereas this, I think they're kind of sort of life rafts that you've given us along the way too, to help kind of digest the story as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in so many ways, you know, books about trauma that aren't funny, you know, they're not readable. Or at least, you know, it's really hard to get through it. Right. And I didn't want that for the woo-woo because, you know, it was like, well, I have to write this book for myself. So the only way I can get through it is to laugh through things. So my reader has to come along. Otherwise, they'll put it down after chapter 1 and be like, I can't read this misery trauma memoir.
Yeah, for sure. Do you find that when you were writing it, having sort of the distance from the actual events, did that help you find the funny a little bit easier?
I think so. In so many ways, I didn't know I was funny until I'd moved to New York, gotten diagnosed, right? There's something about it when you get the sickness and you're like, okay, now I can probably just say whatever I want now without consequences. I'm on the East Coast, I'm in another country. And then the workshop was like, oh, you're actually funny. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know I was making a joke, but if it's working, it's working.
I wanted to ask about your diagnosis because that must have been so clarifying for you, especially growing up how you did, where you didn't talk, like, yes, mental health wasn't talked about, but I think also a lot of physical ailments were blamed on the woo-woo as well. So to have someone say, not only do you have this, but this is like one of the worst cases I've ever seen. And you had that great scene at the beginning where you're talking, that was the other line that made me laugh out loud when you were talking about Whole Foods bags and designer purses thumping you on the forehead on the way up the stairs.
New York City.
The best place to have a breakdown. But how did that feel in terms of just you and being able to continue to do what you do and to be able to live your life now? I think that would be really, really clarifying to have that actual diagnosis.
Oh, for sure. It was a big relief. It was just, it's like, you're not possessed, right? You're not your aunt. You're not going to jump off a bridge. But at the same time, it was just another hurdle for me to go through. And I think, being really frustrated. I was in grad school. I had a book to write. I couldn't read. And so for me, it was like, will I be able to get through this illness? And, I've done okay. I've gotten through it. I'm a very stubborn person. If you haven't noticed, I'm relentless in so many ways. And so, yeah, it was just like knowing that, okay, just another thing that I have to climb and I'm going to do it.
Is the woo-woo, is that something that was coined by your dad?
It was. He didn't know the English word for ghosts, and he assumed ghosts made the woo-woo sound. So of course it became something we do in our family, and then it became the title of my book.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. I was going to ask, in terms of kind of going back to the mental health and the taboo and the stigma around it, I wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about Beautiful One and the betrayal you felt after the bridge incident, because I know that you really looked to her as being like, okay, there is someone who seems normal, who seems to have her shit together in a way that her sisters do not, and then this happens. Can you talk more a little bit about that and just sort of obviously we read about it in the book, but just the processing that went into actually writing about that and looking at it as you were writing about it?
Mm-hmm. I would say that probably was the hardest part to write, because it wasn't, just a plain recollection. It was more about like, well, this is how I feel now. And, emotions even writing have never come really easy to me, right? I rather just make pages and pages of jokes. And then I remember my agent being like, well, are you writing a memoir or a joke book, Lindsay? I'm like, can I write a joke book instead? And she's like, no. So we take a lot of jokes. And so I remember having to sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to be really serious now. It's really hard for me, but how did I feel in that moment? And how did that change for me? And it's still painful, I think, to think about, that relationship and seeing like, well, if someone so normal could go through that, what does it mean for the rest of us? Is there hope for us? Are we all going to end up, on a bridge, having a breakdown? Are we all going to end up being miserable, without that access to mental health, right? Or help from outside the family?
I thought it was a really interesting juxtaposition between what happened with your aunt and then in the chapter, The Other Mountain, seeing an unvarnished mental breakdown happening outside of your family and outside of your home, and what that experience was like for you, because it's like, oh, this exists totally outside. They are not in the aquarium of Woo. They are outside of that completely. So yeah, tell me a little bit more about that, and just writing about that incident as well, and just sort of connecting those dots and kind of seeing, oh, okay, this is sort of the framework I have.
Life is strange, isn't it? Right. So much happens that you don't expect, but I think it was supposed to happen then, so I could just really witness it and see it, because the bridge had just happened. I'd moved to New York. I'd been diagnosed. I was still in the process of getting diagnosed, and then my roommate has, a breakdown. And so for me, it just put everything in perspective. Like, this is what it is like to exist outside of my house, but also see someone else. And for me, I think that was also, it was limiting, shocking, but at the same time, I think, it needed to happen, right? But also New York has so many crazy people. So it's almost like the perfect city, right? to have a breakdown on the subway and cry, right? No one's gonna notice you, right? So if you're going to have a crazy roommate, then it's, you better be in New York.
There is a bit of not a theme, but something that kind of comes back when you're kind of trying to escape your family. So whether it's New York or whether it's Honolulu, and then something just wild happens to you, and then it kind of brings you back home, right? So through that, I guess, I think there is a lot of wisdom in this book too, about just how you can't really get away. Like you can, but you'll always be where you are, kind of thing. And just, having those experiences elsewhere. Fun's igloo was also a very good chapter. That made me laugh a lot. But yeah, I guess just, that idea of, can you ever really escape what you're trying to?
I don't think you can. No, I mean, as horrible as it sounds, I think life is full circle. Like, even with this book, right? Like, we're chatting, I think you called me in Toronto, right, when I was promoting my other book, and now, we're talking about mental health and ghosts in a different way. So everything repeats, right? I think so much of it is, the past is always like chasing us. And I think I'm always writing about that. I'm thinking about trauma. I'm thinking about ghosts. I'm thinking about family secrets, right? We just carry it. I don't know anyone who has successfully escaped. And if they do, let me know your secret, because I'm going to write about it.
Yeah, I think it's so true. And I think it's honestly, it also makes you think about the idea of ghosts in a different way. Like, maybe not the way your mom thought about them. Like, they're not going to come get you if you spend too long on the toilet, but the ghosts of our past selves and the ghosts of our ancestors, and how all those things influence so much of who we are and our lives, and how it's really hard to escape things that are in your DNA,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which and I know this isn't about this book, but I really, Free Press Book Clubbers, and I think it will come to book club, but Lindsay's latest book, Tell Me Pleasant Things About Immortality, don't sleep on it. It is my book of 2023. I love it so much. And it's short stories, it's fiction, but I do see a lot of relationships between that and your writing in the woo-woo. And so I'm wondering how writing about the memoir and writing about ghosts and really sort of getting into the supernatural and the horror in your own life helped you write it fiction about sort of similar subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, because I was actually writing the stories when the woo-woo was getting rejected, right? They always tell you, start another project, don't think about your memoir. And so and short stories, they're, you can do them in a couple of weeks, right? And then put them aside and start something else. Whereas a novel, you need like full concentration. And so I would be, working a little bit, and then we get a no, and you're like, oh, okay. And then, so I think in so many ways, there's some similarities in tone, and of course themes, right? And you're thinking about that, but it's sort of like you can hide in nonfiction, you can lie, which is nice, right? Where in memoir, you can't lie, otherwise you get in trouble.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You can manipulate the truth in memoir, but the facts have to be there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Chris, did you have any other questions before I know we're getting?
Well, I'm curious about the present. You say in your dedication it's about your past, your present, and your future selves, and you're kind of almost in the future of this book and looking back on it. And I'm just there's an intensity to young families that obviously is a part of the story, I guess, of the story you're telling. And as you get older, things tend to calm down, tend to resolve, tend to do those sorts of things. So has there been any of that for you, like with your parents, with your, you allude to you're estranged from your sister, but like, is there resolution, I don't know, coming, I guess?
I mean, is silence resolution? I mean,
Well,
it
columnist.
is in a way, right? I think so. People are too afraid of you, or they're scared you're gonna write about them, and they're on their best behavior in so many ways. I think that is the best outcome, right? Of course, like I think it would be really unnatural and weird if we sat down to Thanksgiving dinner and everyone was like, so I didn't like how I was portrayed in your book. And then you have to have this really serious and weird discussion. But that's assuming that, your family reads, or if they read it, they're going to pretend they didn't. But I think that the happiest outcome is everyone being quiet about it and pretending it doesn't exist. Like, just put it under the table and we don't talk about the book, right? I have a friend who wrote a memoir, and then my parents actually read her book, Jenny Hagen Will's older sister, not related. They read it and they're like, oh, she wrote a good book. And then they don't talk about my book. So, that's the best outcome, I think, right? Having them like fawn over that. They can, pretend their child wrote a book, not me.
So things in your family are a little calmer than they were at the time you're describing then?
I hope so, because no one tells me what's going on. I'm not in Vancouver anymore. So if something were to happen, knock on wood, it doesn't, no one would tell me, right? Because they know, like, okay, she's going to write a sequel. We're in trouble, right? So all I hear about, oh, it's raining. We had chicken for dinner. That's it, right? Nothing exciting.
Would you ever write another memoir?
I don't know if I have enough material. I think most memoirists don't, because unless you like decide I'm going to live with my parents again, for the next like 20 years, right? And who wants to do that, right? Like, but I think I could write, a collection of personal essays, right? I think that's something a lot of people are doing, but in terms of a childhood memoir, I don't think so. But I did write a short piece for the CBC, and so I guess that's like a G-rated version of the woo-woo. I wasn't allowed to swear, so it's very filtered. But I think it could set the truth of it. Yeah.
I know we're kind of nearing the end, but the last question I wanted to ask you is if you still play hockey.
I do not play hockey. After I had vertigo, I didn't do anything. But I was like, oh, maybe I should skate, because I see people like skating on the forks. And I'm like, oh, maybe I should like pick it up again. But then the weather is so cold here. I can't leave the house. Like, I don't know how you all do it. Like, I'm always cold. So
you'll get used to it eventually.
That's what they say, but I don't believe you. I wear like 3 layers of clothing, and like I have like snow pants, and I would like walk to school.
But see, you're walking in the weather. I feel like that kind of makes you a Winnipegger, Lindsay.
But I can't drive, so that's why I have to either walk or bus. So I'm like covered up, and then everyone's making fun of me because I'm just like, it's too cold.
Skating is the best thing you can do in the cold, because it keeps you warm in and of itself when you're active.
I don't think so. I don't know.
Don't believe me.
Maybe my skin will get thicker. I'll like grow fur. Maybe you all have secret fur that I don't have.
Aaron, who usually hosts this, has a theory about winter blood and summer blood, and how like you just have to, your winter blood has to come in.
Okay, I'll look for it.
All right. Well, as we are at that 45-minute mark, I think that will probably do it for tonight. So thank you so much to everyone who joined in tonight and read along with us to read the woo-woo. And of course, thank you again to Lindsay for making the time and being here. Our September book is A Safe Girl to Love by Casey Plett. Casey is Winnipeg born and was also for this novel nominated for the Giller Prize. So we hope you enjoy that and start reading with us. The meeting for Safe Girl to Love will take place right here on our YouTube channel, Monday, September 25th at 7 p.m. And Flight will be there along with our literary editor, Ben Sigurdsson, and McNally Robinson's Jontes, and Charlene Deal, director of Winnipeg's International Writers Festival. We're partnering up with them for this next pick. Once again, we appreciate so much everyone who's tuned in with us tonight. And thank you for reading along. We'll see you next month.